In today's lesson, we're going to learn how to compare fractions using the LCD. So if I'm looking at 1/8 and 1/6, and I want to know which is larger, I'm going to start by looking at the denominator. And if I want to prove it mathematically, I need to make 8 and 6 become the same number. So I'm going to find the LCD and set up my slide method. So I'm trying to think of a number that can divide 6 that can also divide 8. 6 and 8 are both even numbers, so I know that I can divide both numbers by 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 8 divided by 2 is 4. So now I'm going to look at 3 and 4 and ask myself if there is a number besides 1 that can divide 3 evenly that will also divide 4. And there is not a number that they share, so I can stop here and make my L and multiply everything inside. 2 times 3 is 6, and 6 times 4 is 24. So my LCD equals 24. Neither of these fractions have the denominator 24. So I'm going to set them up in a fraction times fraction equals fraction so that it becomes 24. Eight times what equals 24? Well, that would be 3. And if I put it on the bottom, it also goes on the top. 1 times 3 is 3. So the equivalent fraction to 1/8 would be 3/24. Now I'm going to find an equivalent fraction for 1/6. 6 times 4 equals 24. If I do it to the bottom, I do it to the top. 1 times 4 is 4. So instead of 1/6, the equivalent fraction is 4/24. So now I can compare these fractions, and instead of looking at 1/8 and 1/6, I can look at these fractions that are now cut into equal pieces. And if you notice, 3/24 is one piece away from 4/24. So 3/24 is less than 4/24, or 1/8 is less than 1/6. I can also use cross multiplication as a quick way to check my answer. So I go from denominator to numerator and multiply across. 8 times 1 is 8. Now start from this denominator to this numerator. 6 times 1 is 6. And I'm going to look at my two numbers that I got for my multiplication. 6 is smaller than 8. So if 8 is the bigger number, then the side with 8 has the bigger fraction. So 1/6 is larger. This works because what I'm doing is multiplying 1/6 times 8/8, which would be 8/48. And over here I'm taking 1/8 and multiplying by 6/6, which would be 6/48. So these numbers that I've circled are really just telling me my numerator to help me decide which is the bigger fraction. Now let's compare 3/8 and 5/12. I'm going to start by looking at the denominators, and since they do not have the same denominator, I want to find the LCD so that I can create a common denominator. So looking at 8 and 12, I know that they're both even, and I know that 4 can divide both of those numbers evenly. So 8 divided by 4 is 2. 12 divided by 4 is 3. And if I look at 2 and 3, they're back-to-back numbers, and the only number that they have in common as a factor is 1. So that must mean I'm done. So I'm going to make my L and multiply everything inside. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 3 is 24. so the LCD is 24. Neither of these fractions have the denominator 24, so I'm going to set up fraction times fraction equals fraction to get to 24. And now I'm going to fill it in. 8 times 3 is 24, so I'm going to also put it on the top. 3 times 3 is 9. So 3/8 is the same as having 9 over 24. So I write my equivalent fraction over to the side. Now I'm going to try 12. And I know that 12 times 2 equals 24. So I'm going to put it on the top. 5 times 2 is 10. So 5/12 is the same as 10/24. So now using my two new equivalent fractions, I can compare. And once again, 9/24 is one piece away from 10/24. So I need to use a less than sign. So 9/24 is less than 10/24, or if I look back at my original problem, 3/8 is less than 5/12. And once again, if I want to show a quick way to compare fractions, I can use cross multiplication. So I go from denominator across to the numerator. 5 times 8 is 40. And then denominator across to numerator. 12 times 3 is 36. So 36 and 40, 40 is the bigger number, which means 5/12 is the bigger fraction, which is what I got. In our last example, I'm going to compare 7/10 and 2/5. So 10 and 5 do not have the same denominator. So I'm going to set up the slide method for 5 and 10. And a number that can divide 5 that can also divide 10 would be 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 10 divided by 5 is 2. And I see a 1, which means it must be done, and 1 and 2 are back-to-back numbers. So I'm going to put my multiplication signs in. 5 times 1 is 5. 5 times 2 is 10. So my LCD is 10. Now, 7/10 already has the denominator of 10. So 7/10 is going to stay 7/10. So I need to set up a fraction times fraction just for 2/5 to have a denominator of 10. 5 times what equals 10? 5 times 2, put it on the bottom, it also goes on the top. 2 times 2 is 4. So instead of 2/5, I can look at this as 4/10. And 7/10 compared to 4/10, 7/10 is larger. So I'm going to put a greater than sign. And if I want to check it with cross multiplication, 7/10 and 2/5, 10 times 2 is 20. 5 times 7 is 35. Since 35 is a larger number, then 7/10 is a larger fraction. If I were comparing mixed numbers, I would start by looking at the whole number. We just solved 7/10 and compared it to 2/5. All of our steps would remain the same. I would just keep the whole number with the fraction. We said the LCD for these two fractions is equal to 10. 1 and 7/10 remains the same. 2/5 was changed to 4/10. And I keep the whole number with my new equivalent fraction. So now I can compare 1 and 7/10 to 1 and 4/10. And since the whole numbers are the same, I look at the fractions, and I know 7/10 is still larger than 4/10, so it would get the greater than sign. If I was trying to compare mixed numbers like 3 and 7/10 and 1 and 2/5, if you can tell immediately that 3 is larger than 1, then you don't need to find the LCD or change the denominators. 3 will always be larger than 1, so 3 7/10 is automatically larger than 1 2/5. Try these 4 practice problems. I want you to try both strategies, finding the LCD and using fraction times fraction to compare them with the same denominator. You can check your answers using cross multiplication, but you must show your work using both types of strategies. When you write your answers, remember that the order matters. In the circle, you should be able to tell me, is there a greater than, less than, or equal to sign? Remember that as you're choosing your sign, you must write it so that 3/5 comes first, then a greater than, less than, or equal to sign, followed by 1/2.